The sun hung low like a silent witness as Harold Langston shuffled down Jefferson Avenue, his worn shoes scraping across the concrete with the slow rhythm of a man who had lived through too much to move quickly anymore. His back was slightly hunched, his dark skin leathered from years under the southern sun, his hat low over wise, weathered eyes. He carried nothing but a folded piece of paper tucked in his breast pocket. His bank statement. A routine trip. It was a street he had walked for over 50 years, a path lined with memory, and on this day, it should have been just another walk. But fate, dressed in uniform and ignorance, was parked at the curb in a white patrol car, watching him through tinted glass with suspicion sharpened by prejudice. Officer Ryan Colburn, 32, buzz cut, sunglasses on despite the fading light, leaned forward in his seat like a wolf catching scent. To him, Harold wasn't a man. He was a figure, a presence, a question mark that didn't belong on this sidewalk. His eyes narrowed. Alone, elderly, black, walking slowly. Colburn labeled him in an instant. Loiterer, threat, burden. He opened the door with a quick jerk, boots crunching gravel, hand resting near his taser not out of necessity, but habit. Power. Sir, he called, striding forward. Need to ask what you're doing around here. Harold stopped, looked up, confused but calm. Just heading to the bank, he said with the kind of quiet that comes from experience, not fear. But that didn't matter. Colburn stepped closer, reading compliance as challenge. ID? He demanded. Harold furrowed his brow. Why? The word was soft, respectful, but it was too much. Colburn's jaw clenched. Don't question me. Give me your ID. Am I being detained? Harold asked, not with defiance, but with that careful dignity that had once kept him alive in a different America. The cop didn't answer. His hand shot out and gripped Harold's thin arm. The old man stumbled slightly, instinctively reaching to steady himself. And that was it. That was all the excuse Colburn needed. In one violent motion, he grabbed Harold by the back of the collar and slammed him face first into the pavement. A sickening crack echoed against brick and silence. A woman across the street screamed. Someone fumbled for their phone. Blood pooled slowly beneath Harold's temple, seeping into the sidewalk like spilled ink. Colburn hovered above him, breathing hard, adrenaline masked as authority. Stop resisting, he barked, though Harold hadn't moved, couldn't move. Eyes opened wide in confusion, pain, disbelief, not at the violence itself, but at how familiar it all felt. Decades later, and still, the same ground, the same weight. Sirens didn't follow. No aid arrived quickly. Colburn didn't kneel. He didn't apologize. He didn't care. He called it in as non-compliance and waited, standing over Harold like a monument to everything that had gone unpunished. In the distance, lights flickered behind windows, doors closed tighter, and the street returned to its silence, broken only by the soft, fading breath of a man who had once taught his daughter to never bow her head. And somewhere, far from this pavement, a phone would soon ring in a governor's office. The sound of Harold's skull hitting concrete still lingered in the air like a ghost, but Officer Ryan Colburn felt no remorse. He stood upright, arms crossed, towering over the old man sprawled at his feet like discarded trash. A few people had gathered now, hesitant, watching from the sidewalk's edge. Some with phones raised, most with hearts clenched in silent paralysis. They'd seen this before, hadn't they? Another black body slammed down, another uniform shrugging it off. Colburn spoke into his shoulder radio with a voice smooth and indifferent. Possible 1096, male, elderly, non-compliant, medical needed, minor injury sustained during intervention. His words were dry, clinical, carefully chosen. He didn't see Harold bleeding, he saw paperwork. He didn't see pain, he saw procedure. An older black woman from the corner store stepped forward, wringing her hands. He's a good man. Been coming through here for years. You didn't have to do all that. Colburn turned, his sunglasses still hiding the contempt etched into his face. You interfering with police activity, ma'am. She flinched back like he'd raised his hand. Others pulled her gently away, whispering, Don't engage, Don't give them a reason. The power wasn't in the weapon. It was in the certainty that there would be no consequence. Colburn crouched beside Harold, who blinked through a haze of blood and memory, eyes darting but mouth still sealed. Next time, don't ignore commands, the officer muttered under his breath, voice low, venomous. You people always want to play the victim, but you don't follow the rules. Harold could barely move, but his eyes locked onto Colburn's with something deeper than pain. Not fear, disappointment, disgust. It only made Colburn angrier. He saw in Harold the quiet defiance that refused to disappear, even now, even here. That refusal to crumble. You think you're better than me, old man, Colburn hissed, glancing around to make sure no cameras were close enough to hear. You walk around like you earned something, like this world owes you something. Let me tell you, it doesn't. Then he stood, brushing invisible dust off his vest, stepping back just as the paramedics arrived. He didn't help lift Harold. He didn't give a name. He just leaned against his cruiser, nodding at the EMTs like they were cleaning up a mess he was too busy to care about. One paramedic, a young Latino man, looked down at Harold's torn skin and bruised ribs with wide eyes. What happened? He asked quietly. Another one who wouldn't listen, Colburn replied with a shrug. He tripped himself up. Harold was too weak to speak, but if he could have, he might have said, "That's the story, isn't it? A narrative told again and again, where black pain is always explained away, where brutality is routine, and where age grants no mercy if your skin marks you as suspect." As the ambulance doors closed, sealing Harold inside, Colburn checked his phone. Already a few neighborhood blogs had picked up whispers about the incident, but he wasn't worried. Not really. He'd been here before. Complaints came and went. Internal affairs did their dance. The union covered everything in silence. He was still here, still patrolling, still in charge. Because men like him weren't punished, they were protected. That's what the badge meant. Not justice, not service, but immunity. He smirked as he slid back into his cruiser, glancing one last time at the blood drying on the sidewalk. To him, it was just another day. He had no idea that this time, this man, was different. He didn't know that the old man he left bruised and bleeding wasn't just a bystander. He didn't know that the call to the governor's mansion had already been made. And he didn't know that his name, Officer Ryan Colburn, was about to become a household one, for all the wrong reasons. The hospital lights flickered in sterile silence as Harold Langston lay motionless beneath a thin blanket, the bruises across his face blooming in purples and reds, like a cruel canvas painted by authority. Nurses moved carefully around him, their voices hushed, their eyes avoiding direct contact. The police report had already reached the hospital. The official line was in place. Elderly suspect became agitated. Officer responded with measured force. Unfortunate, but justified. It was a script polished through decades. One size fits all for any black body harmed under a badge. Harold's body told another story. Ribs likely fractured, left wrist swollen, temple stitched with 5 neat staples. But no one asked what happened. No one dared. Not yet. In another part of the city, the footage had already begun to circulate. It wasn't long, 30 seconds, shaky, filmed from behind a bus stop. But it was clear. The slam, the thud, the blood, the casual way Officer Colburn stood over Harold afterward. People began to share it, quietly at first, whispers online, screenshots in private messages. Who is he? Why did that happen? He didn't resist. But in the white suburbs and the glass-paneled newsrooms, there was hesitation. The narrative hadn't been confirmed. The man on the ground was just an elderly individual involved in an incident. He had no name, no backstory, no identity. Meanwhile, in the police precinct, Officer Colburn sat comfortably in the break room, sipping from a travel mug with a smirk, surrounded by a few colleagues who chuckled at the brief replay he'd shown on his phone. "Didn't even flinch," he said, dropped like a sack of bricks. A younger officer raised an eyebrow. "Was he armed?" Colburn shrugged. "Didn't get that far. Guy was being difficult. You know how they get, mouthy, stubborn. Think they're untouchable once they get old." Another officer laughed. "Should have just stayed home. Some of them forget this isn't their world anymore." No one disagreed. No one questioned what he'd done. Behind the shield of the badge, the language of cruelty sounded casual, acceptable, even humorous. The racism wasn't loud, it didn't scream. It oozed into jokes, glances, the unchecked confidence that no matter what happened, the department would close ranks. Colburn had been there before. He had a file, complaints from agitated citizens, mostly black or Latino, most of them thrown out or unsubstantiated. He knew the game. He played it well. All he needed to say was that he felt threatened, that he feared for his safety. That phrase was the magic key, the shield that erased bruises, silenced complaints, rewrote history. But this time, something was shifting. In a high-rise building downtown, a woman stood staring at a paused video on her laptop, her hands clenched into fists, her jaw locked so tightly she could feel her teeth ache. Governor Liana Langston, Harold's daughter, had just finished a security briefing when one of her aides, pale and trembling, knocked on her door and said, "Ma'am, I think you need to see this." And there he was, her father, on the ground, his head hitting the pavement, his cane rolling away like a discarded truth. She hadn't even known he was in town. He never wanted to bother her. "Didn't want the press following me," he used to say. "You're governor now. You don't need your old man walking behind you." But now he was broken by a man wearing the very uniform sworn to protect. She stared at the officer's face in the video, the lack of expression, the force, the ease with which he executed the takedown. She felt her heart shift from pain to fury, not just for her father, for every person who had been silenced, mocked, thrown down and then erased. She could hear her father's voice in her head, calm, strong, telling her when she was a child, "Don't ever let them steal your dignity, baby. Don't ever make yourself smaller just so they feel big." She hadn't, and she wouldn't now. Outside the hospital, reporters had begun to gather. They didn't know yet, but rumors were spreading. Whispers that the man in the video wasn't just another victim, that he had a name, that he had a daughter in high office, that this time the story wouldn't be swept away in a footnote. Inside, Harold drifted in and out of consciousness, unaware that the weight of his broken body was beginning to tip the scales. And Officer Colburn, still unaware, walked through the precinct with the ease of a man who believed nothing could touch him. He checked his messages, scrolled social media. A few people had tagged him in angry posts, but he'd been through worse. He deleted them, rolled his eyes. "Another fake outrage," he muttered. What he didn't see, what he couldn't imagine, was that one building away, a team of legal advisors, political strategists, and human rights lawyers were already being assembled. That Governor Langston wasn't waiting for the official investigation, that this time there would be no silence, no erasure, no shield strong enough to withstand the fury of a daughter who had risen through a system designed to keep her out, and now watched it try to destroy the man who had lifted her into it. This time, the badge wouldn't protect the guilty, it would expose them. Let's take a short pause. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from, and have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar in your life? Your story matters to us. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, we continue. The governor's motorcade arrived without sirens, without cameras, just silent urgency slicing through the early morning mist. Governor Liana Langston stepped out with a face carved from steel. No aides, no press. Just her and the weight of 1,000 memories dragging behind every step as she entered the hospital where her father lay. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and injustice. A nurse flinched when she recognized the governor but said nothing. Everyone knew why she was here. The news hadn't broken publicly, but inside the building, truth traveled faster than headlines. Liana pushed open the door and saw him. Her father, the man who had taught her strength without ever raising his voice, now swallowed by a hospital bed, face bruised, lips split, dignity stripped but eyes still defiant. "Daddy," she whispered, and for the first time in years, her voice cracked. Harold turned his head slowly, and when their eyes met, neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. She saw it all in the way he gripped the blanket, how much it had cost him not to resist. He hadn't fought back. He never did. because men like him learned early that resistance came with a price paid in blood, and sometimes in death. He didn't need to say he was sorry. He didn't need to say anything. She knew. But as she sat beside him, something deeper twisted inside her. She had spent her career walking the line between two worlds, the one that built her and the one that ignored her. Her office hung with flags and portraits, but the seat she sat in every day had been earned not by handshakes and promises, but by watching this very man survive a country that never welcomed him. And now that same country had thrown him to the ground like garbage, like his years of sacrifice, his work, his patience, meant nothing. The insult wasn't just physical, it was generational. It was the slap in the face that reminded every powerful black child that their parents' pain was still currency in America. And Officer Ryan Colburn, he didn't know any of this. To him, Harold had just been another non-compliant subject, another old man who moved too slow, who didn't say, "Yes, sir," fast enough. He hadn't just acted on instinct, he had acted on programming, and that programming came from a long, unbroken tradition of racism dressed as protocol. Liana stood, walked to the window, stared down at the city she governed, a city now quietly holding its breath. She knew what her advisors would say. Wait for the investigation, release a soft statement, show composure. But they didn't know what it was like to see your father's blood on concrete. They didn't know what it meant to smile for the cameras while knowing the very system that praised your victory would tear your family down without hesitation. She turned back to Harold. "I'm going to do this my way," she said. "Not as governor, as your daughter." He didn't stop her. He didn't need to. Somewhere, in another part of town, Officer Colburn was starting his shift like any other, joking with colleagues, sipping bad coffee, still smug in the belief that yesterday was already forgotten. He hadn't heard yet. He didn't know the man he slammed to the ground had raised the most powerful woman in the state. But he would. Soon. And when he did, he'd learn what it felt like to be on the other end of a system that no longer turned the other way. Because this time, the victim's voice would not be lost in silence. This time, silence had a name, and it carried the full weight of power behind it. The air was thick with the kind of tension that wraps itself around you and never lets go. Liana Langston had never been one to show emotion in public. She had learned long ago that vulnerability in her position was seen as weakness, especially for a black woman in a state that still harbored more than its fair share of old wounds. But as she sat in her office, staring out at the city below, everything inside her felt like it was boiling over. The hospital had been a turning point. It had been the first time in her life that she truly understood the weight of her father's experiences. Growing up, he had never told her the full extent of the racism he had faced. She had always known that he had suffered, but it was different when you saw it with your own eyes. His blood had stained the sidewalk, and that image, that violence, was something she couldn't unsee. Liana was governor now. She had worked tirelessly to get to this position, breaking barriers that were built specifically to keep people like her from even being considered. But now, in the face of her father's pain, she realized how hollow those accomplishments felt. The power, the influence, the speeches, it all meant nothing when a system could so easily tear apart the lives of those who had been crushed under its weight for so long. It was a system built on a foundation of cruelty, oppression, and racism, and no amount of political maneuvering could change the fact that it was rigged against people like her father. And that was where she found herself, standing on the precipice of something larger than any campaign or policy she'd ever fought for. This wasn't just about a single incident. This wasn't just about a cop or one man's pride. This was about a history that stretched back hundreds of years, a history of injustice that had been built into the very fabric of the country. And for once, Liana wasn't willing to be silent. Her fingers gripped the edges of her desk, the pressure building in her chest. The phone in front of her buzzed again, a reminder that the world outside her office hadn't stopped, that the protests were still growing, still demanding answers. But the weight of her father's blood, of his pain, of the generations of people who had been crushed under the boot of the system was too heavy for her to ignore. The battle for justice had always been personal, but now it was even more so. This was no longer just about policy or speeches or promises. It was about the truth. And the truth was, Her father had been brutalized simply because of the color of his skin. He had been slammed to the ground in front of strangers, humiliated in a way that no one in power had to endure. The more she thought about it, the more the rage inside her began to swell. How dare they treat him like that? How dare they treat anyone like that? This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a mistake that could be swept under the rug with a few empty words. This was a deliberate act of violence, a continuation of a history that had never been addressed, never been acknowledged. The phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. It was her press secretary. She picked it up, trying to maintain a calm tone. "Governor Langston," the voice on the other end said, "the situation is escalating. We need to address the public. The media is asking for a statement. They want to know what we're doing about the officer involved. There are calls for your leadership in this." Liana's grip tightened on the phone, her nails digging into her palm. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'll make a statement," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like we can fix this with words alone. I'll speak when I'm ready, not when they think I should." She ended the call without waiting for a response, her mind racing. She knew what they expected from her. Another carefully crafted message, another appeal to unity, another promise that things would get better if people just followed the right procedures. But those words had never worked. They had never worked for her father. And they hadn't worked for any of the black men and women who had been pushed down, humiliated, and ignored by the very system that was supposed to protect them. The truth was, those systems needed to be torn down. She stood up from her desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the city. Below her, the streets were filled with people. The protests had grown larger each day, their voices louder, more desperate. It was impossible to ignore. It was impossible to look away. And yet, the people in power tried to do just that. They tried to ignore the voices of the oppressed, to sweep their pain and anger under the rug. They hid behind their privilege, behind their wealth, behind their position. But Liana knew that the time for pretending was over. Her father had been a hero. He had fought for his country, had bled for it, and had never once asked for recognition. But they hadn't given him that. They hadn't given him any of the respect he deserved. They had taken his dignity and trampled on it, all because of the color of his skin, and now they would answer for it. Liana turned away from the window and walked to her desk. She picked up the phone and dialed her chief of staff. "I want you to assemble a team. Get the best lawyers. Get every person who's ever fought for justice. I'm not just going to sit by while my father's name gets dragged through the mud. We're going to make sure the world knows what happened, and we're going to make sure it never happens again." Her voice was steady now, the plan forming in her mind. This wasn't just about her father. This was about a whole system that needed to be dismantled. This was about showing the world that those in power couldn't keep ignoring the pain they had caused. As she hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She knew the battle would be long, that the forces arrayed against her would stop at nothing to maintain control. But she was ready for it. For the first time in her life, she was ready to fight with everything she had. The people in the streets weren't just fighting for a single man. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been crushed beneath the weight of this country's history. And Liana was ready to stand with them. She would not back down. She would not be silenced. She would fight for her father. She would fight for the people. And she would fight for the truth. And in that moment, she knew that everything was about to change. The news had spread like wildfire. Within hours of the video being shared, it was everywhere. The brutal, unapologetic violence against Harold Langston had captured the attention of the nation. The image of an elderly black man being slammed to the ground by Officer Ryan Colburn, a man who wore his badge like a weapon and his arrogance like armor, had ignited something that no one in power could control. The protests had swelled beyond the state's borders. Cities across the country were filled with people demanding justice, people who were tired of seeing their lives discarded, tired of seeing their fathers, their sons, their brothers crushed under the heel of a system that had been designed to maintain its own power at all costs. But inside the walls of the governor's office, the storm was just beginning to form. Liana Langston stood in front of a small conference table, a tight knot of advisors and lawyers surrounding her, all of them offering suggestions, most of them too safe, too measured, too predictable. The room was filled with the buzz of strategy, but Liana had already made up her mind. She could feel the pressure, the weight of history bearing down on her. But this time, the choices were different. This time, she wasn't going to bow to the demands of a broken system. She wasn't going to settle for appeasement. "We can't wait any longer," Liana said, her voice cutting through the chatter in the room. "We need to act. This isn't just about one officer. This isn't about one moment. This is about the systemic racism that has been allowed to fester for decades, and we're going to make sure the world knows it." Her words hung in the air, heavy with resolve. The room fell silent. The media, the protests, the mounting pressure, it all culminated in this single, decisive moment. The lawyers and advisors exchanged glances, uncertain. "Governor," one of her senior aides began cautiously, "while we understand your anger, the message must be careful. We have to maintain control. We can't let this become another divisive issue." The backlash from the police union. Liana cut him off, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "If I worry about backlash, I'll be sitting in that office, doing nothing. And I've had enough of that. This ends now." The aide hesitated, then nodded, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. The mayor's office had already put out a weak statement, one that tried to distance the city from Officer Colburn's actions. But it wasn't enough, not by a long shot. Liana knew that no apology or small gesture could undo the harm that had been done. The system was broken, and the only way to fix it was to tear it down, to expose its corruption for what it was, and make sure that no one, especially those in power, could ignore it. Back in the streets, the protests were growing in intensity. They were no longer just about Harold. They were about everyone who had been made to feel inferior, everyone who had been humiliated, oppressed, and erased. The voices calling for justice, for accountability, were no longer just cries. They were demands. Demands that couldn't be ignored. Demands that had found their way to the very heart of power. But the opposition, those who sought to maintain the status quo, were not sitting idle. The police union, which had long held the reins of influence, was already mobilizing. They had gone into damage control mode, organizing press conferences, threatening legal action, trying to downplay Colburn's actions as a simple misunderstanding. They knew better than anyone how to weather the storm. They had done it before. Every time a tragedy like this unfolded, they closed ranks, ignored the evidence, and protected their own. They were the enforcers of a system that had long been built to serve them, and they weren't about to let one officer's mistake unravel it all. But this time, it was different. The people were too loud, their anger too raw. The events of that day, Harold Langston's broken body, the video that had gone viral, the image of the cop standing over his victim with pride, could not be swept under the rug, not this time. No one was going to forget. As the protests surged, the streets outside the state capitol building were packed with people. Black, white, Latino, Asian. Everyone who had been touched by the brutality of the system. Everyone who had been left behind. They were chanting now, their voices rising together in a unified roar. No justice, no peace. It was a cry that echoed through the streets, shaking the foundations of the city. This wasn't just a protest, it was a revolution, and Liana Langston was at the heart of it. Liana knew what it would cost. She knew the system she was about to challenge would fight back with everything it had. The police, the unions, the media, they would all turn on her. They would call her radical. They would label her as someone who wanted to dismantle the very foundation of law and order. But she didn't care. Not anymore. Her father's blood had been spilled, and it had awakened something inside of her, a fire that would burn through the corruption, through the lies. She couldn't go back to the way things were. She couldn't sit in her office playing politics, while people like her father and people like the ones marching in the streets were treated as less than human. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from one of her aides. "The mayor wants to meet with you. He's asking for a meeting to discuss strategy." Liana's jaw tightened. She had no time for strategy anymore. She wasn't going to play their games. She wasn't going to let them pull the strings. "Tell him no," she said, her voice cold. "I'll do things my way." The aide didn't respond, but Liana could feel the weight of her decision. She was stepping into unknown territory. She was challenging a system that had been built on the backs of people like her father, a system that had been built to protect men like Officer Colburn. And she knew that if she didn't stand now, if she didn't make sure that her father's pain, her people's pain, was heard, then she might as well be complicit. The phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't her aide. It was the media. They were asking for a statement, asking her to comment on the growing unrest. The world was watching. She didn't hesitate. Liana walked to the podium, her father's image flashing across the screen behind her. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with the intensity of everything she had carried inside her for so long. "This is not a moment for words," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This is a moment for action. For too long, we have stood by while men like my father have been mistreated, brutalized, and erased. For too long, the system has told us that our lives don't matter. But today, we stand together and we say, enough. Enough of the lies. Enough of the abuse. Enough of the silence. I will not let this go. I will not let my father's blood be spilled in vain." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising higher, stronger, and for the first time, Liana felt the weight of history in her bones. She knew that this was only the beginning, that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that she was no longer fighting alone. The people were with her, and together, they would not stop until the truth was laid bare for the world to see. The crowd outside the Capitol had grown massive. What started as a few dozen angry protesters had quickly turned into a sea of people, their voices rising in a single unified demand for justice. The chants echoed down the streets, reverberating off the cold marble walls of the Capitol. "Justice for Harold," they cried. "No justice, no peace." The streets had become a battleground, one where the fight for dignity was as urgent as it was necessary. People from every walk of life had come together. Not just black people, not just the marginalized, but everyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice. Liana stood on the balcony overlooking the scene, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't the first protest she had seen in her career, but it was the first one that made her feel as though something real, something monumental, was about to happen. The weight of her father's blood, still fresh in her mind, burned within her like an eternal fire. She had stood on this balcony before, in her polished suits, giving speeches with carefully crafted words, promising change, offering hope. But today was different. Today, her promise wasn't just for reform, it was for reckoning. Behind her, the door to her office creaked open. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Governor." It was Senator Daniels, one of her longtime political allies, his face drawn with concern. "We need to talk." Liana didn't turn around. Her eyes remained fixed on the throng of people below. "I know what you're going to say," she said, her voice cold but steady. "And I don't want to hear it." Daniels sighed heavily and stepped closer, but he didn't dare to touch her. "This isn't just about your father anymore. You know that, right? The media, the unions, the police, they're not going to back down. They're going to make sure you're painted as the radical, the troublemaker, the people who support you now. They'll turn on you just as quickly when the heat gets too much." "I'm not backing down," she replied, her voice firm. "You don't understand. This isn't just about one officer. This is about the system, the same system that has been oppressing people like my father for centuries. This is about a history of racism that has been ignored, buried, and denied. I'm not going to let them sweep this under the rug. This isn't about politics anymore. This is about justice." The senator's face tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew better than to argue with her now. Liana had always been determined. But this was something different. The fire in her eyes was no longer about political ambition. It was about something far deeper. And in that moment, he realized she wasn't just standing for her father. She was standing for all the people who had been crushed under the heel of the system. Below, the crowd's chants grew louder, more insistent. It was a call for action, a call to be heard, to be seen, and Liana felt the weight of it, the responsibility of it all. She could feel her father's presence in her bones, the way he had always taught her to stand tall, to never bow her head. He had sacrificed so much for a country that never truly embraced him. And now, it was her turn to fight for him. To fight for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than human. "What's the next step?" Daniels asked cautiously, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "We need to be careful. The police unions are already preparing their defense. They've got their spin on this. They're making Colburn out to be a victim, that he had no choice, that your father provoked him. You can't just—" "I don't care about their spin," Liana interrupted sharply, turning to face him. Her eyes were cold now, hard. "We've been spinning their lies for too long, Senator. The people know the truth. And they're not backing down. Neither am I." Daniels looked at her, his expression softening slightly. He could see the determination in her eyes, the same fire that had made her a force to be reckoned with in the state legislature. He knew she had always been a fighter, but this was different. This wasn't a fight for votes. This wasn't a fight for a political position. This was a fight for something deeper, something that transcended everything she had ever known. He couldn't help but admire her resolve, even if it meant watching her face the full weight of the establishment, the media, and the very system that had helped put her in power. "We'll need to act fast," he said, his voice quieter now. "They're going to try to smear you. They'll make this about your father, about your anger, about the radical rhetoric. They'll twist everything. We need a unified front, Governor. If we don't move carefully, we risk losing control." Liana's gaze hardened. "I don't care about control. I care about what's right." There was a long silence between them, a silence filled with the weight of everything she was about to do, everything she was about to unleash. The stakes had never been higher. Liana knew that the moment she took this fight to the next level, she would become the enemy to those in power. She would become a target. But there was no turning back now. As she stood there, looking out at the crowd, she realized something. She had always known that the system was broken, that it had been built to favor the powerful, the privileged. But now, in the face of this injustice, she understood just how deep the corruption went. The system wasn't just flawed, it was poisoned, and it needed to be torn down. The people were with her. They were tired of waiting for change. They were tired of being told that their voices didn't matter, that their lives didn't matter, and if the system wanted a fight, they would get one. She wasn't going to stand idly by while they crushed her father's legacy, while they silenced the people. She wasn't going to let them destroy everything he had fought for. "We're going to make them listen," she said quietly to herself, the words steady but full of purpose. Daniels could feel the weight of her words. It was clear now that Liana wasn't just playing the game anymore. She wasn't just trying to appease the political powers that be. She was going to dismantle the system, piece by piece. And that meant she would need to take on the forces that had been in place for generations, forces that had protected men like Officer Colburn, forces that had allowed this kind of violence to continue unchecked. The door to her office opened again. This time, it was one of her top advisors, a woman with sharp eyes and a determined posture. She had been in the field for years, fighting for change, fighting for justice. "We've got movement," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "The FBI's officially opened an investigation into the incident. They've already been in contact with Colburn's department. The city's pressuring us to release a statement on behalf of the police. The unions are pushing back hard. They're claiming the protests are too extreme, that they're disrupting the peace." Liana's jaw tightened. "Disrupting the peace," she repeated, her voice growing colder. "They're the ones disrupting the peace. They're the ones who've been oppressing us for centuries. It's time for them to face the consequences." The advisor nodded, her expression grim. "We're preparing for a major backlash, but we've got momentum. People are starting to see the truth. They're with us." Liana took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She had always known that this day would come, the day when she would have to stand up not just for her father, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been crushed beneath the weight of the system. And now, with every passing minute, she could feel the walls of that system starting to crack. She looked back out at the crowd. The people were no longer just protesting for Harold. They were protesting for themselves. They were protesting for their dignity, for their right to be treated as equals. They were protesting for justice, and she would make sure they got it. "We're not stopping," she said quietly, but with undeniable conviction. "We're just getting started." And with that, Liana Langston, the governor of the state, stepped into the battle that would define her legacy. A battle not for power, but for the truth. A battle for justice that would shake the very foundations of the system. And she wouldn't stop until every last person who had ever been oppressed had a voice. The city had always been divided, but the rift that had existed for generations was now exposed for the world to see. The protests that had started as a cry for justice for one man had erupted into a movement that threatened to change everything. The streets, once quiet and complacent, were now filled with the sounds of determination, of anger, of pain. People of all races, backgrounds and walks of life had come together, unified in their demand for justice, but their cries were being met with resistance. Resistance not only from the police, but from the very systems of power that had sustained the oppression for so long. Liana Langston stood in the midst of it all, watching as the city she had once tried to protect with all her heart now teetered on the brink of chaos. The FBI investigation into Officer Ryan Colburn's actions was gaining momentum, but it wasn't enough. Not for the people, not for her father, not for the ones who had been crushed under the weight of systemic racism for decades. The people wanted more than just an investigation. They wanted change, they wanted accountability, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Liana's phone buzzed again. She had been receiving messages from every direction. Lawyers, political strategists, even family members, all telling her to calm down, to pull back, to let the system work. But Liana knew that the system had never worked for people like her father, for people like the ones protesting in the streets. She had grown up watching her father swallow his pride, watching him nod respectfully to people who treated him as less than human. He had done it for her, for his family, for the hope that maybe one day things would be different. But now, after seeing what had happened to him, she understood. There was no waiting. There was no more silence. She glanced at the messages quickly, all with the same tone. Don't make this political. Don't let the anger control the narrative. Protect yourself. But there was no protecting herself anymore. There was no protecting the system that had allowed Colburn to act with impunity, that had allowed her father to be treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. The anger was no longer just an emotion. It was a necessary fuel. It was the fire that would burn down the walls of complacency. She wasn't going to stand by and let them turn her into the villain, to make her out to be the radical. No, she was the one who would make sure the truth came out, no matter how ugly it was. Her mind raced as she made her way through the halls of the Capitol building, the weight of every decision settling heavily on her shoulders. She had already made one move, shutting down the negotiations with the police unions, publicly calling for the resignation of Colburn's superiors. But that wasn't enough. She knew that. She needed more. She entered the press room, where reporters were already gathered, their cameras focused on her as she took her place behind the podium. The room fell silent. This was it, the moment that would define her, the moment when she would either rise to the occasion or be consumed by it. She could feel the eyes of the nation on her, waiting for her to speak. Liana took a deep breath, steadying herself. The events of the past week have shaken this city to its core. What happened to my father was not an isolated incident. It is not a story about one officer, one mistake, one moment of violence. It is a story about a system that has systematically dehumanized and oppressed black people for centuries. My father was not just another victim of police brutality. He was a man who served this country, who fought for freedoms that were never extended to him, and yet he was treated like a criminal in his final years because of the color of his skin. And that is something we cannot allow to continue. Her voice was strong, unwavering, each word cutting through the room like a knife. She could feel the weight of the room shift. The reporters, the cameras, they were all watching her now. They had come here expecting the usual platitudes, the typical politician's response. But Liana Langston wasn't a typical politician. She wasn't here to play their game. She was here to expose the truth. The violence that my father experienced was not an accident, she continued, her gaze steady, unflinching. It is the result of a culture of racism, of a system that has given police officers the power to abuse, to humiliate, and to destroy lives with no consequences. Officer Colburn's actions were not the actions of one rogue individual. They were the actions of a man who knew he could do whatever he wanted, without fear of punishment, because this is the world we live in. A world where black bodies are disposable. A world where our voices are silenced. The room was still, hanging on every word. For the first time, Liana saw the shift in the faces of the reporters, the unease in their eyes. The story was no longer about a single officer or a single incident. It was about something much larger, much more dangerous. It was about the heart of a system that had been corrupted by its own prejudice. "I will not stand idly by while this continues," Liana said, her voice unwavering, filled with purpose. "I will not remain silent while my people are crushed under the weight of this injustice. I will not allow the history of oppression to continue. It is time for change. It is time for a reckoning. And I will not stop until that change has been made." She could feel the eyes of the nation on her now, the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She had stepped into the battle not just for her father, but for every person who had ever been mistreated, every person who had been cast aside. This was her moment. This was the moment when she would either bring the system to its knees or be crushed by it. As she finished speaking, the silence in the room was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all waiting for the next move, for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The reporters were writing furiously, their pens racing across the paper. The world was watching. The stage was set. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The backlash had already begun. The police union had issued a statement calling for her resignation, accusing her of fanning the flames of division. The mayor had already voiced his support for the department, claiming that Colburn had acted within his rights, that the protests were unjustified, that they were threatening the peace of the city. The backlash came swiftly, but it only fueled the fire that was already burning in Liana's chest. The opposition wanted her to back down. They wanted her to retract her statement, to apologize, to tone it down. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. The truth had been revealed, and it wasn't just her father's blood that had been spilled. It was the blood of every person who had suffered under the same oppressive system. She left the press room and walked into the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the empty building. She knew what was coming. She knew that the fight was just beginning. But she also knew that she was ready for it. This was her fight now, and she wasn't going to lose. In the streets below, the crowd had only grown. They weren't just protesting anymore. They were fighting for their lives, for their dignity, for their right to be treated as equals in a world that had long denied them that right. And as Liana looked down at the crowd, her heart swelling with both fear and hope, she knew that this was the moment that would change everything. The system was shaking, it was crumbling, and it was time for it to fall. The collapse had begun. The days following Liana's speech were unlike anything the city had ever seen. The air was thick with tension. Protests continued to swell in numbers, with thousands of people filling the streets day after day, demanding justice for Harold Langston and an end to the systemic racism that had suffocated the black community for generations. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a reckoning. And Liana knew that this was only the beginning. The media had a field day with her words. The backlash from the police union, the mayor's office, and conservative media outlets was swift and predictable. They painted her as a radical, a politician who was willing to tear the fabric of society apart for the sake of a single incident. Political theatre, they called it. Divisive rhetoric. They tried to silence her, to discredit her, to make her into the villain. But what they didn't understand was that Liana had spent her whole life navigating a world designed to undermine her. She had heard the whispers, the jabs, the subtle racism veiled in polite conversation, and for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of it all coming crashing down. It was no longer just about her father. It was about the generations who had been silenced, humiliated, and erased. And she wasn't about to stop now. Behind the scenes, the wheels of power were turning. The mayor, a man who had once praised her rise to power, now found himself in a position where he could no longer sit on the sidelines. His political career was on the line, and he knew it. The protests were growing more intense by the hour, and the demands for justice were being heard across the country. The FBI's investigation into Officer Colburn's actions had gained momentum, but the pressure from the police unions was mounting. The old guard was making its stand. They had their own narrative, their own version of events, and they weren't about to let Liana disrupt it. As Liana sat in her office, reviewing the daily updates from her staff, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Her chief of staff, Jordan, stepped in, his face tight with concern. "Governor, it's getting out of hand," Jordan said, closing the door behind him. "The police are pushing back harder than ever. They've issued a public statement calling for your resignation. The unions are rallying behind Colburn. They're claiming you're inciting violence, that you're making this about race when it's not. They're even threatening legal action." Liana's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. "Let them," she said, her voice calm but filled with determination. "They can't stop this now. The truth is out there. The people know what happened. Colburn's actions weren't a mistake. They were a pattern, a reflection of a system that has treated black people as less than for as long as anyone can remember." Jordan hesitated, his eyes flickering with concern. "I know you believe that, but the political cost is rising. The mayor's office is coming under fire too, and they're not happy with the way things are going. They're pushing for a compromise, something to de-escalate the situation. They want you to tone it down." "I don't care what they want," Liana said, her voice steel. "I'm not going to let them control the narrative anymore. I've spent my entire career listening to their demands, their lies, their attempts to make me small. I'm done. This isn't about compromise. It's about justice. And if they want to bring me down for speaking the truth, then so be it." Jordan sighed, but there was no arguing with her now. He had seen the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had driven her to the top, the same fire that had never allowed her to back down from a fight. But this was different. This was a fight that would consume everything in its path. "Then we need to get ready," Jordan said, his voice resolute. "The next step is crucial. We need to make sure the people's voices are heard. We need to rally the support we've built. If we back down now, we'll lose everything." Liana nodded, her mind already racing with the possibilities. The time for talking was over. The time for action had come. The next day, the protests reached a boiling point. 1,000 people gathered outside the Capitol building, their voices rising in unison, demanding justice. The air was thick with the energy of a people who had had enough. The energy was contagious, and soon the streets were filled with even more protesters. Black, white, Latino, Asian, young and old, each of them fueled by the same rage and hope that had driven Liana to take her stand. They were marching not just for her father, but for every black man and woman who had been oppressed, marginalized, and brutalized by the system. But as the protesters gathered, tensions began to rise. The police, now emboldened by the backing of their unions, began to deploy heavy force, lining the streets in riot gear, armed and ready to defend their own. The city had become a powder keg, and Liana knew it was only a matter of time before it exploded. She watched from her office window as the situation unfolded below. The protesters were peaceful, their chants echoing in the air, their signs held high, demanding justice. But the police stood in formation, their presence a stark reminder of the violence that had been inflicted upon the black community for years. The faces of the officers were cold, indifferent, ready for the fight they had been told was coming. Liana stood, her hands clenched at her sides. She had been in this position before, watching from the sidelines as others fought for change. But today, she was not on the sidelines. She was at the heart of it, and she would not let her people be crushed by a system that had never once valued their lives. She walked down to the streets, stepping out of the Capitol building and into the crowd. The protesters parted as she approached, their eyes filled with hope, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. They had come here for one reason: to be heard, and Liana was here to make sure they were. As she reached the front of the crowd, she was met with cheers, with chants of her name. But there was no time to celebrate. The police were closing in, their formation moving forward, slowly but surely. The tension was palpable. "This is our moment!" Liana shouted, raising her fist into the air, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We will not be silenced any longer. We are here to claim what is rightfully ours: justice, equality, and dignity. We will not stop until the system that has oppressed us is torn down, and we will stand together, no matter what they throw at us." The crowd erupted into a roar, their voices rising to meet hers. And then, as if on cue, the first wave of officers began to push forward, their batons raised, their shields held tight. The peaceful protesters stood their ground, fists raised in defiance, their eyes locked on the officers. Liana watched as the first clash occurred, an officer pushing into a young woman, knocking her to the ground. The crowd surged forward, but the police held their ground. A voice in her head screamed to stop, to back away, but she didn't. This was it. This was the moment when everything changed. And then, through the chaos, a voice cut through. "Liana!" It was her father's voice. She turned, her heart skipping a beat. Her father, Harold Langston, was standing at the edge of the crowd, his cane in hand, his eyes bright with a fire that had never gone out. He wasn't just standing there. He was walking forward, slowly, with purpose. The same man who had been crushed by the system, who had suffered under its weight, was now moving through the crowd with the same dignity he had carried his whole life. Liana stepped forward to meet him, her legs trembling with the force of the moment. "Daddy, no!" He raised his hand, stopping her. "This is my fight too, Liana. I fought for this country. Now it's time to fight for myself." Her father, bloodied but unbroken, stood beside her, his presence a symbol of everything they had fought for and everything they would never let go of. The crowd parted around them, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had lived through more than anyone should have to, and still stood tall. And together, they faced the future. Together, they faced the broken system that had failed them, and together, they would tear it down. The battle was just beginning. The world seemed to stand still for a moment, as though the weight of history had hung in the air, heavy and thick. The streets outside the capital were alive with movement, but inside, everything felt frozen, held in place by the enormity of the moment. Liana Langston stood at the front of the crowd, her father by her side, his cane tapping softly against the ground as a reminder of the years that had been stolen from him by a system that had never cared about his life, his dignity, or his humanity. The air crackled with the sound of distant voices, chanting, shouting, demanding justice. The tension was palpable. The police, once a line of authority, now stood on the other side of a growing divide, their presence looming, oppressive. But today, it was different. Today, the world was watching. And Liana had made a vow that she would never stop fighting until the system that had crushed her father, and so many others like him, was destroyed. She turned to her father, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time in a long while, she saw something in his face that she hadn't expected, a kind of peace. It wasn't the peace that came from resignation or acceptance. No, this was the peace that came from knowing that, after all these years of struggle, he was finally being heard. He was finally being seen. And together, they were about to make sure that the world would never be the same. "You're not alone, Daddy," Liana said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "We've got this. We'll finish what we started." Harold nodded, his face weary but resolute. He had spent his life fighting for his country, fighting for his family, fighting for his dignity. But this fight was different. It wasn't just about one man. It was about everyone who had been forced to shrink, to silence themselves, to make themselves small just to survive. It was about breaking the chains that had bound them for generations. And he wasn't about to stop now. With a deep breath, Liana stepped forward, raising her hand in a signal for the crowd to fall silent. Slowly, the noise began to fade, and all that was left was the steady, determined beat of their hearts. The people were with her. They had always been with her. And now, more than ever, they were ready to stand up for the change that had been promised, but never delivered. "We've come a long way," Liana's voice echoed across the crowd, sharp and clear. "But we're not done yet." The crowd was still, hanging on her every word. There was no more hesitation, no more uncertainty in her voice. "We've spent too long accepting what we've been given, too long accepting the scraps of justice that have been thrown at us and told it's enough. We've spent too long watching as our fathers, our mothers, our children are treated like second-class citizens. But that stops now. Today, we take back what has been stolen from us. Today, we make sure that our voices will never again be ignored. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers swelling in unison. But Liana raised her hand again, silencing them. This isn't just about one officer. This isn't about just one incident. This is about a system that has allowed violence, hatred, and cruelty to go unchecked for far too long. This is about the men and women who have been forced to live in fear. Fear that their lives will never matter. Fear that they will always be treated as less than. This is about every black man, woman, and child who has ever had to swallow their pride just to survive. This is about breaking that cycle. She paused, her breath steady, but her heart racing. This is about making sure that my father's blood and the blood of every person who has been hurt by this system was not spilled in vain. We will not stop. We will not rest. We will fight until justice is no longer a hope, but a reality. The crowd was in a frenzy now, the sound of their chants filling the air with raw emotion. The energy was electric, alive with the promise of change, of action, of something that felt too big to be ignored any longer. And yet, standing on the opposite side of the crowd, behind the barricades of police officers, there was a tension that simmered just beneath the surface, a quiet unease that threatened to erupt. Liana turned to her father, who had been standing silently by her side watching the crowd, his eyes fixed on the horizon. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers curling around his with a tenderness that only he would ever understand. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Harold looked down at her, his expression softening. He had never been one for grand speeches, never been one to seek the spotlight. But as he looked out at the people who had gathered, the people who had come to stand with him, with them, something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time, a feeling of power, a feeling of hope. "I've waited for this day my whole life," he said quietly, his voice hoarse but firm, "and I'm not going to let them take it away." As they stood together, hand in hand, Liana's eyes scanned the crowd once more. She could feel the eyes of the people on her, waiting for her to lead them. And she knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a fight for her father's dignity. This wasn't just a fight for justice. This was a fight for every person who had ever been told they were less than, every person who had ever been treated as inferior, as disposable. This was a fight for the soul of the nation. The police officers, standing in their line with shields and batons, were the embodiment of the system they were all fighting against. They had been trained to maintain order, to control, to dominate, but they were not the ones in control now. The people were. Liana stepped forward, her voice steady, filled with authority. "We will not be intimidated," she declared. "We will not back down. We are done waiting. We are done pleading. We are done being silenced." As her words echoed in the air, something shifted. The police, for the first time in weeks, seemed uncertain. They had always been the enforcers, the ones who maintained order, but now they were faced with something they had never anticipated: the collective power of a people who had been forced to bend but refused to break. The officers could see it in the eyes of the protesters, their determination, their strength, their unity. They could see that this time they were not just fighting for a single man's dignity. They were fighting for the very soul of a nation. A heavy silence descended over the crowd. Every eye was trained on Liana as she raised her hand once more. This time, the gesture was not for silence, it was for solidarity. "We are one," she said, her voice ringing out across the crowd. "And we will not stop until justice is served." The crowd's response was immediate, overwhelming. The sound of their voices filled the air, a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment when the tide of history began to shift. The empire built on oppression, on control, on violence, was finally beginning to crumble. Liana Langston had made her stand, and she would not be moved. The fight for justice had just begun, and the world would never be the same again. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about the events and the fight for justice? Have you ever experienced or witnessed racism in your life? Your opinions and experiences matter to us, and we truly value each and every one of you. Don't forget to like this story and subscribe to hear more. Have a wonderful day, and if you've listened all the way through, let us know by commenting with a phrase that stood out to you.